Welcome to another edition of the Forecast Contest. Today's February 18th, and our target window, the 16 to 20-day window, hard to believe, but we're in March now, March 4th to March 8th, and we're continuing the forecast HDDs. We'll forecast HDDs through April. Let's see. So I think for today's agenda, we'll follow I think a similar format. We'll start with attribution. We'll kind of look back the last couple of weeks, and then we'll talk about the forecast, and then, of course, we'll leave it open for any kind of interesting research or just operations items that come up during the call or folks want to talk about. And we are trying a different time this week. It's 10:30, just because some of the folks there suggested 10:30 could be a better time. So we may just kind of move things around here over the next couple months to kind of experiment with different times. Before we dive into it, are there any other specific topics that folks want to make sure we cover in today's call? Any interesting items? No? Okay. Let's start with attribution then. So I think the last verification is from January 28th, verifying the 5-day window, verifying on the 16th. All right, so I guess this was noteworthy. I was just talking about this with Michael before the start of the call. I think it's noteworthy in that it seems that we're starting to see some changes in the pattern. It feels like, sometimes just when you get comfortable with the endless warmth or something like that, what Mother Nature changes on you. I think we saw that here a little bit. So the verification was almost 148 HDDs, and that's relative to the 30-year normal, which is 140.5. So it was actually a little bit colder than normal. So folks who were up in that end did relatively well. Paul Roundy had a nice forecast there. The ECMWF was pretty good. And here, actually, let me sort this by CRPS. So again, you see Paul and ECMWF near the top. Professor Decker also did better than normal. On the flip side, on the other side, I'm near the bottom. But then you have the CFS. Reliably bad. And I guess, and I say that half jokingly, but I think reliably is an important word because sometimes it can be good for like a bias correction. Industry struggled a little bit with this one too. Obviously we had some warm forecasts down there after several weeks of warmth. And kind of, again, this feeling that things were going to maybe stay warm. We can look at I'll pull up the radiance verification here for the 12th to 16th, so we can look at that too. Folks, you guys can feel free to kind of jump in at any point here. But here's the surface pattern. So you can see the blues and purples are colder than normal, and you might be able to see the values there. Looks like about a -6 in Chicago, -10 in Minneapolis. Still kind of warmish along most of the East Coast, except up there where Professor Schaefer lives in Vermont was pretty cool. Still warm in the Southeast, warm in the West. So that's the surface pattern. Let's also take a look at the upper air pattern for the same period. We've talked a lot about, Michael, I think, talked a lot about this last week, this positive NAO just that won't quit, and that was clearly visible here with the big trough in the North Atlantic, and ridging in the East Pacific, again, allowing a little bit of cold air to slip into the middle part of the country, but not quite all the way into the Southeast. So that's the pattern there. And then we can also look, I'll just pull up some of the charts here in terms of the MGO. There's the MGO. So again, this was the period they verified on the 16th. So you can kind of see that up here, looks like we verified in kind of phase 6 there. So typically phase 6 can be a transition depending on which way you look at it. I think some of the analytics suggest it's cool. Some suggest it's still warm but transitioning to cool. So I'm not sure it was a clear signal there. One other thing I want to look at too, just before I shut up, I always like to look at what the forecast is now coming in, like the next week, which obviously. So this is going to be the forecast verifying for the 19th to 23rd. Of course, it's not, it's still going to change a little bit, but usually you have a pretty good idea of how that's coming forward. And I personally like to look at that for attribution, but also to kind of give a heads up to, or information that could be helpful in the next forecast. All right, so this is for the 19th to the 23rd. And so we can look again, we can kind of cheat and look at what Radiant's showing. And again, it's going to change. This is obviously their forecast, but it's kind of getting to the short term, so probably not going to change too much. And so the estimate right now is about 141 from Radiant, right, or Maxar. That's what their estimate is right now. So if we look at the forecast for the 19th to the 23rd, 141, I think it's interesting, probably not surprising, but so again, we're seeing some signs of change here. So it looks like another forecast that's going to come in above the 30-year, colder than the 30-year, and noteworthy, above every forecast in our forecast distribution. So if it verifies at 141, as currently projected by Maxar, it will be above. And I say above because it seems like, again, over the last couple months, we've been able to say below, but not above too much. And so it could be a tough week for some of our forecasts here. Again, after seeing so many weeks of generally the forecast coming in warmer than normal, we're seeing some signs for change here. So let me stop there, take a breath, open it up. Does anyone else have anything that they'd like to add in terms of this recent period attribution, in terms of what drove it, what's going on, and maybe also any thoughts on some of the changes here, and if we really are going into a colder regime, or is this just more variability?
Well, the only thing I can add is for the current verification is in my I guess formula statement, whatever, the read more portion, I mentioned that the cold on I think the CPC was near Chicago, but it wasn't in Chicago, so it at the time. So I mentioned that could result in the forecast being 10 HDDs colder, which I guess did happen since Chicago was a bit on the colder side. I don't know if that was the what that led to the whole forecast being that cold, but it definitely didn't help. If you were a warmer forecast like me, anyway.
That's a good point. Let's at least bring up the Maxar report. Was that again from the 28th? We always like to kind of look at that, right, and see what get a little bit of a better look on what the world was seeing back then. All right, so this was make sure I got this right? Yeah. This was the Maxar report, the archive from January 28th. So you can see their forecast in the top left, and you can also see the CFS and the EC forecast here on the bottom. And it's funny. Yeah, I mean, the CFS pattern, I know it got crushed in terms of the value because it was just way too cold. But from a pattern perspective, maybe it's a broken clock, but not bad, right? I mean, look at that pattern. What do we say? Warmth in the west, cool in the middle, and then a little bit of cool up in Vermont, right? And then a little less cool. I mean, it's too cool, but it did kind of capture that pattern, no?
Yeah,
A little bit.
Looks it to me anyway.
Or is that? Or it's the 12th to 16th. Go back to it one more time. Yeah. Kind of. Yeah. Not bad. And the EC, I mean, I guess you could argue the EC, you know, I think, you know, this is obviously what I'm saying is completely subjective, but if this were my only data point, it, you know, you could argue that there was a pattern signal here. You can at least argue it, right? I mean, you could, I don't know, it doesn't look 180 degrees from what verified, let's put it that way. Okay, any other thoughts in term before we switch over to the forecast? Any other thoughts on this?
I'm trying to figure out how the so I guess if I remember right, the industry forecast verification score was not all that good, but the map that I'm looking at seems reasonably similar to the observations. So I'm curious how they ended up with not so good of a actual score, right?
I think
let's look back.
Based on the map, their numbers were significantly lower because they have Chicago is -1 to -2 HDDs, and it looks like they were around -6. So
they kind of sort of the opposite of the CFS, I guess, sort of a kind of the right pattern, but just not the magnitudes.
Yeah, that's my 2 cents anyway.
Yeah, it looks like they were on the wrong side of normal here, right? So normal was 140-ish, they were 137, and then verification was 148. So that, you know, they were going to be worse than climatology just by that fact.
Yep.
Yeah, you're right though. I mean, this is a situation where it's not, you could say the same thing, I think, though. If Steve Bennett were here, he'd probably say, I could see Steve saying something like, this might be a situation where the number, is not as valuable. Their pattern was actually provided maybe some value, right, above climatology, above just saying everyone is normal. You can make that case, I think. It's a little bit, you know, it's always hard when you're playing these subjective games, right? Because, you know, of course, you know, we're always biased to the East, right? And if you just look at the Southeast, I think it's much easier to make that argument. Like the Southeast was warm, right? But when you look at the Northwest, when I go back there, of course, the Northwest was not right? I mean, it was warmer than normal. New England, they had the bend right, but of course, you know, it was a lot cold. It was colder than normal up in New England. And how'd they do in the South Central? Let's go back to the South Central real quick. What was that? South Central Texas was pretty cold, right? And so that wasn't right either.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you like Maxar, you say, yeah, I see, they got it right. If you're not, if you subscribe to CWG, you say, no. I'm just kidding. But yeah, it's a tough one, I think. It really depends what regions you're focused on, I think, in terms of how you score this. But it does bring up, like, it would be great to have sort of a regional score, right? That would be kind of cool to be able to have like something that maybe breaks down the United States into, I don't know, 6 regions, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or maybe it's just 3, or maybe it's whatever, something like that. That'd be kind of cool. Something to think about. Any other thoughts about the pattern? I do wonder a little bit. I don't think Jason Lynn's on the call, but if he were, I'd probably ask him, you know, what's going on, and this kind of gets us into the. This might be a, you know, more shifting to the forecast a little bit, but actually let me go back and just look at. I was just looking at the pattern a little bit. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of convection, and now this is more contemporaneous. But you know, why is, just in general, why are we starting to see more cooler themes now? in terms of the current verification, in terms of the next verification, in terms of just a general 2 to 3 week forecast, as compared to where we were for a couple months, where it seemed like in most cases, the cold really struggled to come forward. I know Mike or Jason was talking a lot about some different failures of, we'd see the MJOs come out and you wouldn't get the, like example being this one in January, and you wouldn't get a good canonical type response, right? There wasn't the connection to the extratropics for different reasons. I wonder what's changing now. Before we switch gears, anyone have any thoughts on that before we switch to the forecast? I think the last thought I put out on that is I know some folks have done some research, but I think it would be really cool. And I think this could be a student-ish project, certainly non-student too, but looking more into the relationships between MJO or tropical force and extratropics. And I'm not saying it in a complex way, just, in the same way where we've developed a lot of these empirical tools and saying, hey, when the MJO is in phase 1, what's the temperature response? I think trying to come up with some nifty kind of things like that, but that tie in extratropics with tropics. So, is there a way where we can better understand, like if the PNA is initialized, if the MJO is in phase 1, but the the PNA is already has a base state of negative PNA, does that enhance the impact 10 or 15 days later? Does it, oppress or suppress it somewhat? I think just looking at some of those kinds of analyses could shed some interesting results and potentially in some of the relationships. Okay. So let's switch over to the forecast. So again, today's 18th. These are the forecasts from today. Looks like we've got a range on the cold side of 140 HDDs by, you guessed it, the CFS. And on the warm side, trend is, the 30-year trend is about 108 HDDs there. So who would, and we've got a lot of forecasts in the middle there. It looks like Paul Roundy is still, and Philip, it'll be interesting if he's on the line here to get his view, still kind of fading on the warm side, but we've got some human forecasters that are at least a little bit on the cool side too. So yeah, who would like to kick us off?
I could start. Since mine's pretty simple because it's just the CPC, and usually other forecasters refer to that anyway, so maybe I'll start with my interpretation of the CPC, which comes in with a lot of blue on the map, although some of that blue is not in that populated of an area. But overall, I figured the above normal in Florida is almost irrelevant, perhaps, because there aren't many HDDs in March down there. So I did go with above normal, I think about a quarter sigma or so above normal based on those blues. And I upped my sigma, I think just a little bit to account for the fact that, I guess similar to the forecast that just verified, where if that cold gets into Chicago or into Philadelphia, that could really ramp up the HDDs. So that is my forecast.
Yeah, so definitely leaning on the cooler side here, a little bit, right? Cooler side of things here, Professor Decker. Any questions for Professor Decker before we move on? Someone else? All right, Michael?
Yeah. Okay, so my forecast was for 120.9 HDDs, which is slightly above the 30-year normal of 116. Confidence was normal at 24 HDD spread. As usual, looked at the teleconnections, CPC, and the 30-year. Most of the teleconnections indicated a more, not necessarily a cold west, but a slightly cooler west, with PNA looking like it wants to head back towards negative. NAO looks around neutral or positive. I'm just going to assume it's positive until I don't want it to be. And the AO looks like it's finally coming down from its record-breaking positive phase, where it hit 6 twice. Don't quote me on that. And the CPC also had a fairly cold pattern in the west, kind of confirming that. The only risk to the forecast might be mentioned in the CPC discussion, where they mentioned that the southeast ridge could make a reprisal, and if that ridge really starts getting going, could push some of those positives deeper into the northeast and certainly into the mid-Atlantic. So that could bring down some of the HDD numbers. So that's the main risk to the forecast, my forecast that I see. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Mike, where were you saying? You were talking about that southeast ridge? Did you say the models, or did you say Maxar?
It's in the CPC forecast discussion.
The CPC. I got it. Got
Yeah.
it. Got it. Cool.
One of their models picked it up. Did it say the JMA?
In general, do you look at this as a bona fide change? Do you feel like the regime is changing from, basically right since, again, this is somewhat subjective, but since December, we've in general been in a warmish regime. Do you feel like things are really making a change here where when we look back at, this, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 week period, that we're going to say that this is a different regime than what we were in Jan and half of Feb?
I mean, it's hard to argue with the current data available, which has shown this week's verification and now looks like next week's verification are both going to be on the colder side. And so I'm not sure exactly what changed, but it does look like something has changed. Maybe it was only a matter of time before just the cold air just decided to show up just normally. Maybe it has something to do with that monstrous storm that was out near Greenland the other day. I think it might have broken some pressure records with that, but I'm not sure. Maybe that has something to do with it. But I'm not entirely sure. But it does look like something's changed.
I think. Well, I mean, I think two things. First, I think it's a really good point about the storm. That's an interesting point. Sometimes, I think there's a view out there that sometimes it just takes a strong synoptic event that can then alter, trigger a bigger impact on the regime. Something beyond 3 and 5 days. I think there's a precedence for that, or at least folks who believe that certainly can be the case. It's not always that the seasonal scales influence the synoptics, but sometimes the synoptics can influence the longer time scales. I think that's an interesting point. But I also want to go back to, you've talked a lot about, and I guess I'm saying this also with my industry hat on. So I'm trying to be a jerk here. You've talked a lot about the AO being positive and using that to fade your forecast warm here. I'm still seeing the AO largely positive when I look at, the different maps and whatnot. What's the risk here that if the AO has been in part why we've been so warm, why aren't the models going to mishandle this again? And we're just, the cold's going to get bottled up in Vermont and places northward, and, the HDs are going to come in warmer.
Well, there was a dip in the AO during this forecast period that allowed the cold air to sneak into more sustained cold, I guess, in the Midwest, since it's been a little bit colder there, based on the verification. With a more transient cold shot in the east, where I think it was cold for 1 day, maybe 2 days. So you don't necessarily need a negative AO for there to be cold air, other factors can force down the cold air. You just won't get a sustained record-breaking cold event usually without there being some type of negative AO. And that being said, the AO shouldn't be looked at in a vacuum. It just happens to that this particular season it's worked out reasonably well that if you forecast just off the AO, you probably would have done fairly well.
Well, I want to dig into that just for a second. Let me ask, if is the AO at all, and I'm sorry if you already said this because I wasn't thinking about it in this context when you were going through your thing, but is the AO influencing at all your forecast formula? Does it influence it warmer, colder, or are you not looking at it sort of almost semi-independently like you were in some of the previous weeks?
So for this particular forecast, I looked at it as more of, well, it's decreasing and it's from its record positive down to a more, I guess a more meager positive is the word I'll use. So I kind of took that as, well, it's decreasing. It's not exactly the right word, but you know what I mean. Yeah, so I kind of took that as more of a, well, it's allowing for some more cold to get into the pattern if you ignore that slight jump in several of those ensembles. But towards the end, it looks like most of them, even one of them is on neutral, so you don't, like I said, we got a decent cold outbreak around the 16th, 12th to 16th period with a dip in the AO, so I don't see why we couldn't get another one with another currently forecast to be more significant dip in the AO. As for previous forecasts, I kind of just took it as, well, it's increasing and it's going to be super positive, so that probably is a warm signal. That was basically my thinking with it at that point.
So I know I'm picking on you a little bit, but I feel like this is a good example where we, all forecasters sometimes get in trouble a little bit. I feel like there's a little bit of heaven and haw in there a little bit. Like I as an industry, as with my customer hat on, not sure I quite understand what's different this week than last week, other than the forecast is a little bit colder. And so I think this is my interpretation of what you're saying. Not that you're saying this, but as a client, I'm feeling like he's saying, well, the forecast is looking colder, so I don't buy that AO, correction anymore. Whether it was really worked or whether it didn't, I'm fading that AO correction because the forecast is getting colder, and so I'm discounting it. And maybe that's the right move, or maybe it's not, right? Because I think an argument on the other side could be, hey, but every time the forecast looks like it's going to come in less positive, like it's shown in the top plot, look what happens in the bottom plot. It verifies positive. So maybe this is another example of, hey, don't fade that AO. It's gonna work. Maybe it doesn't work every time, but it's still gonna work in general. But regardless, right, I think this is also a great example of why you want to try to measure, right? We want to try to test these hypotheses and saying, like, hey, is there really something here that provides value? If the AO is in a very positive state, does it really can you use this as a predictor outside, semi-independently from the models? Or is that just forecasters kind of coming up with something diagnostically that really doesn't work too well, and as soon as things change, we give them up? So yeah, I'm being hard on Michael here, but I think I think it would be interesting. I think this is a perfect example of why you want to have a methodology on paper, so that when you get into these situations, everyone know exactly what your methodology is, and you can test it with that and test it objectively as opposed to subjectively, when sometimes bias and other things can contaminate the results a little bit. All right, I'm done picking on Michael. But this is, I think, really helpful. Any other questions for Michael? Okay. I don't know who else is on the line, but is anyone out there would like to go next?
Yes, I can go next.
Sure.
So, quick summary is that I got my value of 111.2 HCDs with a spread of 24, which is slightly below the confidence of a mean one standard deviation of 23, but pretty close to it. So I said it was near average confidence. So to break it down, going to the equatorial Pacific, we see very strong convection, and we also note another burst of convection east of Indonesia. And I noted that if you compare the velocity potential with the MJO signal, you can see that there's some disagreement where the MJO signal has it more so in phase 6, which would place it more so with that signal that you see in over Indonesia, or it's sort of averaging the two locations, it seems. So I wasn't completely sure how to interpret that, but I used a combination of lag composites from phase 6, and also if we look at the forecast, the model seemed to suggest it might head towards phase 8 or stay in the null phase. So I also used the lag composites for phase 8. And then combining that with the MJO analog that we have in the contest, I got a value of around 113.9 for the MJO signal. And then combining that with the El Nino, I said that the tropical signal was slightly warm. So I put that as 113.5. CPC was already mentioned with that cold in the northern tier, especially in the plains and in New England. So I treated it as a cold signal for this period, and we'll see how that turns out. And for the teleconnections, as Mike mentioned, we have a very positive AO, and the NAO does seem to be forecasting with a trend towards neutral, but that's not a very certain forecast, as we've known. And the PNA, so that's heading towards neutral. If we look at the PNA, it appears that the PNA is switching from a slightly positive state into a more negative state, which seems to be at odds with the dynamical models, which we'll mention later. And then the EPO, I noted, also seems to be switching from positive to negative. Now, based on the fact that the EPO isn't negative yet, and also the fact that the PNA looks to be negative with a positive AO, I said that these mixed signals, I treat the teleconnections as a warm signal, but I didn't want to go too warm because there seems to be some disagreement with how you interpret these teleconnections. So now going to our dynamical models, the first thing I noticed is that both the EC and the CVFS have this trough in the east and a ridge over the west coast, or a little west of the west of the west coast. So in the North Pacific, you can see that there's that ridge that seems to be stretching into Alaska, which would, to me, suggest a positive PNA or a negative EPO, but it seems like the models want to put a negative PNA for some reason, which I found that a little confusing. And if you look at the actual temperature departures, you'll notice that the ECMWF has the cold sitting in the plains into the Rockies, while the CFS has the cold, it seems, in the southeast and into the southern US, even stretching to here. So both of those are cold signals, and so putting that together, I got my value of 116.8, which is slightly cooler than climatology. Now, I did not look at the verification for the previous week when I put in my fudge factor of -5 to account for warmer concerns. So if I had looked at that, there's a chance I would not have done that. But I'll stand by what I did. With regards to the pattern change, it seems to me, like sort of Michael alluded to, that if you look at the overall pattern, it doesn't look like there's any real pattern change. So it seems to me more as if the cold is just getting a little stronger into the northern plains Midwest region, rather than an actual pattern shift where the cold is really switching to a different region of the globe, or a different region of the country. At least that's my interpretation of what's going on. So it seems like the models are trying to head into a pattern shift as we get into that early March period, but maybe this is also a little too subjective, but at least from what I remember from last year, where there were a lot of times these pattern shifts always end up being a little delayed. So to me, I would say I would want to see another week where we see this pattern before I really buy into the pattern change.
I think that's an interesting distinction that you make about, pattern change versus, just a realignment is kind of how I interpreted what you said, which where, globally from a global perspective or hemispheric perspective, it might not be that much of a change in terms of it's not like, like even like the AO pattern, like you mentioned, like I agree. Like subjectively, when I look at this, I see a lot of mid-latitude ridging, and I see a lot of troughs up north and whatnot, but maybe just sometimes it just takes realignment. And if you happen to be in that one cool spot, then, you can be cold, right? As opposed to, full-fledged, hemispheric change or something like that. What did you say your number was? Did you say, is this right? Or did you say 116?
It was 116, but then I put in a subtract 5 to account for warmer concerns based on earlier in the season.
Gotcha. I do think I think that's interesting too. And obviously my forecast, I did go in a different direction, but I think this is like I feel like we say this every week, but I think this is going to be an interesting one to see how it comes forward, because in some respects now I kind of want to go back and open up my spread or like lower my confidence, because I do feel like after some of what Philip said, I could see a scenario here. I think you brought up a good point. Also, I think about the zoom in a little bit. Was it North America? No. I guess it's fine view. But what you said about the East Pacific Ridge, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to say that if this is really the center of the ridge over the next, in this period, like the core, that there would be a lot more troughing near Alaska. And if the NAO doesn't change, then all of a sudden, does this cold get spread out a lot more, right? Does it end up being a lot more diluted? And then all of a sudden, HDDs again come in a lot warmer. Maybe there's a pocket of cold in the middle and a pocket in New England, but overall, the Southeast, where a lot of key demand is, ends up being a lot warmer. I mean, that's I think a very, very plausible scenario and deduction to make from this. In part, how to get to Philip's forecast there. Anyway, that was good explanation. Any questions for Philip? No. Anyone else on the line who would like to throw in their 2 cents, even if they didn't make an official forecast? I don't know, Jay, if you're still with us, but you're welcome to share your thoughts. Did he leave?
Yeah, he left.
He left. Oh, okay. Well, I guess I can share a couple of my thoughts here. Well, I guess so my number is 125. And again, other than maybe thinking that I should open up the spread, I kind of went with sort of a normal spread. I didn't have, I couldn't think of a good reason to go significantly higher or lower. I did have a little bit of a fudge factor here, going above. It's the first time using above for a while. But the main reason I did this was, I guess really it's just, it's sort of subjective, a blend of things, but seeing, some information here that we're seeing a change. We've last week, the verification I think was close to normal. This week it's higher demand than normal. It looks like the next week is going to verify normal or a little bit above normal. And then looking into the 2 to 3 week forecast, it looks variable. So I felt like that was one data point. And then I also updated our little HDD change chart. And I thought this was relevant, I guess, and important. I factor into my view anyway. So as been talked about, the MJO is initialized, or at least the RMM version of the MJO is initialized somewhere out here in this 5.6 world, right? I don't have it up right now, but we've looked at it a couple times, right? Somewhere up there. And again, just a reminder, what this chart shows is, in this case, we're looking at HDD change, not anomaly, but change as a function of the phase and amplitude. And it's looking at the change from the next 5 days versus the 16 to 20. And I updated it so that it's, relevant to the current time period. It does not have a progression filter, or it doesn't assume any kind of progression. And I thought that was important because, it's not clear that we're going to see good progression. But the takeaway for me was, this is a pretty good signal. I thought that for change, pretty strong signal. You're seeing, HDDs, 10, 15 HDDs. So I thought that, along with the information that we already have, and again, just some subjective interpretation, I guess you could say, looking at this pretty good OLR signal out there in the Westpac, I guess ultimately led me to believe that if there is an error, going back to sort of some of the stuff that Philip was talking about, that if there is a little bit of an error in the pattern, then I think it's a little bit more likely that this ridge is going to do, like that's seen in the EC, is going to look a little bit more like what the CFS is showing. That there's more likely that it's going to get projected north and east. That there's a little bit more wave breaking that the models are underestimating, or at least the EC, and that would push a little bit more cold central and east. And that was it. That's basically my my thought process in terms of how I got to that 125 HDDs. Any questions for me on my process?
So Dave, just want to
MJO change diagnostic. So is that independent of any seasonal cycles? So in other words, is that cold signal actually even colder because you would expect just by default the HDD should decrease as you go from February to March?
It's a good question. I think how did I normalize that in terms of the change? I think I have to. That's a good question. Let me double check that and then get back to you on exactly the methodology on that. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, it's a good question. So what Professor Decker is saying, and it's a really good point, is normally this time of year, if you go from mid-Feb to mid-March, your HDDs are going to decrease, right? Just normals decrease, and they start to decrease significantly in late Feb and early March. So if you don't account for that, you're just going to get some sort of slide just due to that. I think I normalized it somewhat, and you can see here that obviously when it's in phase 1 and 2, but I do have to double check on that to see exactly how I did that. Yep.
Okay. So the MJO analog is a little bit slightly below average, but so that's because there's a difference between the change and if you just do the if you just got the anomaly of the HD, right? That's why we see the difference.
That's right. So Nat brings up a good point here too. So this is the MJO analog was slightly warmer than the 30-year. Now this is right. This is an anomaly, and let's look. Do I have it up? Yeah, I do. So it's pulling explicitly. This is the data point it's initializing from. So it's going to pull a radius of points, kind of like where I'm circling, somewhere in that area. So what it's suggesting is that in order for it to still be warm, it must have been initialized from a very warm starting point, right? Assuming these two are consistent, I think they should be relatively consistent in terms of their methods. They're not exactly the same. But what it's suggesting is, if they are consistent, that because this is suggesting that obviously it's a lot colder 16 and 20 days later, So it must have started from a really, really warm starting point in phase 5. Like, let's say initialize, minus 20 HDD anomaly, and then shifting to a minus 5 anomaly, so that it's still a lot colder, right? Going from minus 20 anomaly to a minus 5 anomaly is quite a bit colder. The shift is quite a bit colder. It would reflect here as a blue, right? It would show here. But if we looked at this in terms of an anomaly chart, it would still be on the warmer side. And I think that's probably what's going on. And I think that's also consistent with other metrics. So for example, if we look at, this is looking at, one of the sort of classical sort of empirical composite type things. And this is looking at this kind of time of year. And this is looking at phase 5 and phase 6. You can see in phase 5 and 6, contemporaneously, you're really warm, right? Typically, you're really, really warm contemporaneously in phase 5 and 6. It's not until you shift over to like phase 8, look where you see this sudden shift. So I think that could be right in that, again, it's highlighting the fact that there is a significant change colder, but the starting point. And by the way, this gets into something else. The way I've thought about it, this is again subjective. The way I've thought about it is completely subjective, what I'm about to say. But I think there's probably more value in the change and factoring the change from the starting point. So in other words, if you have, but I would love to test this. Like if you have two scenarios where it's the kind of winter where it's, I don't know, mostly cold, right? And so phase 5 and 6 only produced maybe a normal pattern, right? It warmed up, but it was only to normal. Versus scenario 2, where more like this winter, I guess, or other winters where it's super warm. And let's say that phase 5 and 6, the background state, along with maybe the MJO, produced a period where you're, minus 20 HDDs or whatever. The question is, should you apply the same change function? In this case, a plus, 15 or plus 10. I don't know the answer to that, but without knowing the answer, I think it makes sense to do it, right? In other words, wherever you're starting from, if you're starting from in phase 5 where you've been, about normal, add 15 to that, versus if you're starting from a minus 15, add 15 from that. That's kind of the way I look at it without having any other data. But that would also, I think, be another interesting analysis to say, does change kind of function apply, to all scenarios, or does it depend on your base state?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Nat, since we're talking already, any thoughts? I don't know if you heard me ask this question before, but let me ask it again. Any thoughts? Like I remember the last couple of weeks. I know I don't think you were on the call last week, but we just talk about how some of these MJO events, like this one in January, maybe didn't have as much of an impact on the pattern as you might expect from like a canonical type response, right? It didn't get super cold, and I know you and I remember, because I know we talked about some of those events. Any thoughts in terms of why, when you look at this event, this ongoing event, any reason, anything that you see that jumps out to you that says, yes, this event may have more of an impact than some of the previous events? Or when you look at this, is that Monday morning quarterback? Is this just like another one of these situations where, there's really no clear-cut signals, and we, at the end of the day, we won't know until 2-3 weeks from now when we look back?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm still trying to recover from that forecast, because I thought when we had that big MJO signal, we would see something that looked like what you would expect, and that turned out to be like a huge bust to the forecast, where it just seemed like it's like the positive AO signal was dominating and was not going to budge but with anything. So so has anything changed? I don't know, except that we do see a little bit more. This does seem a little bit more pattern. Is not as sticky. We're seeing these shots of cold air So maybe I don't know, speculating, but maybe it's just the seasonal cycle and maybe earlier in the season, maybe that just the strong polar vortex was really dominating some of these other signals. Now the climatological vortex is starting to weaken, and maybe that makes it easier to budge from these other tropical forcings. So, but that's all purely speculative.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, it's sort of my interpretation of what you said is it's kind of a hard problem. It's not clear, but I do think, something you said about the seasonal change. Remember, John Davis over at Rispulse used to always say, this is just from his years of experience, but when you start getting to the end of February, you kind of throw out whatever happened before then, right? Because the end of February into early March, it really starts to behave much more. This is my interpretation of what he said, more radically, because the seasonal breakdown, right? You're starting to transition seasons, wavelengths start to change. You just, whatever assumptions you were making, be careful about applying those assumptions, into late Feb and March. So I think it was good advice. I've never tested it, but I think it's good advice. Yeah. And I was just, and something else, I don't know if you caught this too, but Michael brought this up and I thought it was a good point too. You said, has anything changed, right? Michael brought up the point that, that we did have that giant storm in the North Atlantic. I think there were reports that it was one of a top 5 low pressure event.
Like 919 or something.
Yeah, right. It was like a Cat 5 hurricane. And again, so that was obviously a big event. That's a fact, right? Yeah. And I think now, I'll just say this more experientially, subjectively. I think sometimes with those synoptic events too, it takes the models. There could be multiple sort of responses from the models before they really grapple on the full effects. So it wouldn't surprise me. I know that's not saying much, but it wouldn't surprise me, right, if there aren't still some more downstream impacts from that as the pattern fully feels the effects from that. And at the very least, it's a wild card, right? It's a little bit of a wild card. So that was a good point.
But in terms of your interpretation of the current situation and how that might impact the forecast, maybe more, CFS-like with the ridge and the trough over the east. I mean, I think that sounds like if there is going to be a strong tropical fingerprint, I think that's a pretty good idea.
Yes, it's definitely be interesting. So we'll have to remember this one too. Just looking at this pattern, I think it's pretty interesting. I mean, the CFS clearly shows, right, something that it looks like where maybe something you would expect, again, more canonically with the tropical forcing, with that strong signal, a little bit more wave breaking. And
that's more like, looks a little more like February 2015-ish than what we've seen. And
yeah. So it will be really interesting to see this and to see how this verifies. And again, this would be another great example of another interesting research project would be to kind of look at some of these things where we look at the tropical forcing tied to some of the initialized base states, whether it's positive AO and things like that, and actually test some of those theories to see if there is a change in the expected response based on how the extratropics are initialized, or is that just, or is the effect just, do we make more of it than it really is? I think that's always the question. Like, maybe there is a small effect, but it's really small and we make too much of it. Maybe not, right? But those are those are the questions I think we want to try to answer, right? So, I know we just have a few more minutes. Anyone else want to bring up anything before we finish? Michael, anything on your end?
No, nothing on my end.
Good. Okay. I think we can end a few minutes early there. So, yeah, thanks. Thanks for everyone participating this week. By the way, quick housekeeping note, Zach's not here, but I believe it's next week where we're going to switch it to, at least for 1 week, we're going to have our meeting on Friday. And that's to facilitate a little bit Paul Roundy. Professor Roundy is going to join us and some of his students there. I think that's next week. So just pay attention to your calendar. I know Zach's been sending out emails. It's either next week or the week after. And it's just going to be a one-time thing for now, and then we'll switch back to Tuesday. And the last thing, too, we're still going to make our forecast on Tuesday. Just feel like that's keep things simple. But, again, we're going to have the actual discussion on Friday. So, okay. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. And we'll see you again next week. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.